Okay, so once again, my name is Jennifer Steller, and I'm the author of Ink-Stained Amazons and Cinematic Warriors, Superwomen in Modern Mythology, a history of female heroes in pop culture from the 1930s until now. And I'm honored that Katrina has asked me to provide a brief presentation on the history of action heroines in film and television. So keeping in mind that this will be brief, very brief, buckle up, hold on to your hats for From Helen to Hit Girl. Audiences love ass-kicking babes and gun-toting warrior women, and yet action heroines are overwhelmingly outnumbered by action men. We know popular culture both reflects and influences social mores, that American women's roles have evolved, and in fact, female and male roles have changed. Yet many modern hero stories, like those of classic world myth, continue to privilege male experience and fantasy, while women in these stories, regardless of how kick-ass, capable, smart, or skilled they may be, are typically limited to the supporting roles of love interests, temptresses, and sidekicks. Women, of course, can be these things, but who can also be more. As the title of this panel rightly asks, where are the action chicks? There were few action heroines in American film and television until the mid-20th century. An early example, however, is stunt woman Helen Holmes, who starred as the eponymous Daredevil in the long-running silent film serial The Hazards of Helen. Though the later film starred Helen Gibson, she was just as noted for her daring as her predecessor. Jumping forward a few decades and across the pond to 1960s era Britain, where Dr. Catherine Gale and Mrs. Emma Peel of the television series The Avengers and the unparalleled Modesty Blaise proved that popular culture was primed for female adventurers of independence and sexual sophistication. Honor Blackman starred as Kathy Gale, and at the time noted that she was a first for television, a feminist academic anthropologist in black boots, leather suits, and could kick your ass with judo. When Blackman left the series to star in the James Bond film Goldfinger, Diana Rigg was brought in to portray Mrs. Emma Peel. Fashionable, witty, and charming, Mrs. Peel was a delightful intellectual and could more than hold her own in a fight, even when upside down and in gravity boots. She, of course, was also the model for the Diana Prince era of Wonder Woman. Modesty Blaise was the star of a daily comic strip that ran for nearly 40 years, as well as the heroine of 13 books, and she's my favorite. She was also the subject of one terrible movie, and one mediocre one. The less said about these, the better. Regardless, Modesty, highly trained, resourceful, compassionate, and the leader of a global crime syndicate before retiring in her mid-20s, remains one of the most complex, cool, and intriguing characters of all time. And she has been influential on a number of subsequent action and superheroines. Honey West was the first female action hero on American television, and I should note that Trina Robbins will have a Honey West comic book coming out from Moonstone. Anne West starred as Honey, a sexy, tough cookie private investigator. I said Anne Francis. Did I? Okay. I only got 10 minutes, Trina. Anne Francis starred as Honey, a sexy, tough cookie private investigator that ran her own detective agency, and in an all-too-rare reversal of gender roles, had a male sidekick who deferred to her authority. In the United States, action heroines' popularity in the late 60s and through the 70s was facilitated by second-wave feminism, and the momentum of the political movement afforded kick-ass female characters a timely marketability. But it was Linda Carter's lovely and graceful embodiment of the iconic Wonder Woman that inspired so many of us to get up out of our seats and twirl along with her as she magically transformed from her alias to her true Amazonian identity. Joining Wonder Woman were Police Woman, the Bionic Woman, and Charlie's Angels, and though these action heroines were awesome, television in the 1970s walked a fine line between embracing real women's changing roles and maintaining normative ideas about femininity. Female leads presented conventional notions of beauty, white, athletic, and more often than not blonde, and in fact, In the 1970s, the only action heroine of color in a leading role on television was Theresa Gray's Crispy Love in Get Crispy Love. Some of the most influential and at the very least memorable action heroines can be found in unconventional genres. Low-budget and exploitation films in the 60s and 70s presented a paradoxical combination of exploitation and empowerment with results that are as repressive as they are subversive. Tura Satana's Varla in Faster Pussycat Kill Kill is the leader of a girl gang, drives fast, knows karate, is impelling sexually, but is essentially an illness. Jane Fonda's Barbarella is an independent space traveler, as secure and exploring the final frontier as she is in her sexuality, but our nearly naked heroine frequently requires rescue. Mary Warnock starred as badass race car driver Calamity Jane in the cult classic Death Race 2000, but she dies. And the Doll Squad, about a group of awesome female commandos, is totally ridiculous. Blaxploitation films, particularly those of Pam Grier, presented a type of warrior woman never seen before. Her tough, independent heroines protected their communities with brains as well as guns, and exacted vengeance against those who wronged them or their loved ones. Blaxploitation is also one of the few places where we find women of color in action heroine roles. That is, of course, outside of martial arts cinema. In the 1980s, conservative politics and media resulted in a backlash against the feminist movement and strides that had been made in the previous decade. Popular culture again privileged masculinity, emphasizing it even, as action heroines were overshadowed by muscular action men, and women in film and television were all too often resituated in more gender-normative roles by their story's end. Notable examples of this include Princess Leia of the Star Wars trilogy, who began her story as a rebel leader, but by the end was merely a sister and a love interest. Valeria, the glorious, sinewy warrior woman played by Sandal Bergman in Conan the Barbarian, is an independent thief and glorious badass turned love interest who sacrifices her life for that of the hero. Brigitte Nielsen's Red Sonja is a master swordswoman who, through her adventures, becomes a mother figure and is repeatedly told to be nicer to men because, she needs their help or something. Others include Erin Gray's Colonel Wilma Deering on Buck Rogers, Faye Grant's Dr. Julie Parrish of the mini and television series V, and Supergirl. She was played with such conviction and grace by the lovely Helen Slater, but sadly, ultimately, our heroine's adventure revolved around a cat fight with a cougar for the affections of a man. 1984's B-movie classic Night of the Comet, a genre mashup of horror, sci-fi, and comedy about Sister Sam and Reggie, sassy, smart teenagers who kick zombie ass in a post-apocalyptic SoCal, and served as inspiration for Joss Whedon's Buffy Summers. Despite the privileging of muscle men, one of the most memorable action heroines of all time emerged in Sigourney Weaver's Lieutenant Ellen Ripley, and though the character had appeared in 1979's Alien, it was in the sequel that Ripley took center stage. And as with other action heroines, Ripley adopted and protected a child, but this in no way softened her character, and said child, Carrie Hens Newt, is an action hero in her own right, having survived alone for weeks on an alien-infested planet. Aliens also featured a third action heroine of note in Jeanette Goldstein's Private Vasquez, a butch Latina Marine that is braver and fiercer than her male comrades. Girl power and adult culture makers influenced by second-wave parents facilitated some of the most complex women of popular culture to date. And in the 1990s, entertainment media once again reflected liberatory ideas about what women were capable of accomplishing. The first of these was Sarah Connor of 1991's Terminator 2 Judgment Day. The character had evolved from her first incarnation as a feather-haired waitress to a full-fledged warrior. And reinforcing this was the fact that Linda Hamilton's physical transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. And Flux, a lawless assassin that first appeared on MTV, remains as startling, subversive, and disturbing as she was 20 years ago. Xena, a former warlord on a quest for redemption, and her companion Gabrielle, a farm girl turned warrior bard, kicked ass and had a playful, loving, and complex partnership that made them LGBTQ icons. action heroine could be a doctor and a scientist. But perhaps the most influential action heroine of the decade, and certainly the one with the most lasting influence, is Buffy Summers of Joss Whedon's seminal television series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She's embodied by Sarah Michelle Gellar and created with the intention of being a feminist role model. But since I could go on for hours